Hello, valued listeners. This is Jacob, and today I'll be joined by Justin. We're here to discuss post-World War II global economics, a topic that's really important to understanding the whole world around us, but is seldom talked about. So, Justin, why don't you give us a brief introduction of yourself?
Hi, Jacob. Firstly, thanks for inviting me onto your podcast. It's a great honor and pleasure. I am basically an up-and-coming content creator and author. My interest lies across fields of politics, history, culture, economics, and developments in geopolitics and a bit of philosophy. So, yeah, I'm working towards getting some books published. So, yeah, that's kind of where I am on the spectrum, so to speak.
Excellent. And I definitely know that Justin here is very knowledgeable about economics and really brings it from an angle that I find very interesting and extremely informative. So with no further ado, let's begin talking about what is probably the most important and fundamental thing for us to begin understanding economics in the post-World War II world, and that is the Bretton Woods meeting and all of the agreements that came out of it. So why don't you begin giving us a little bit of background on that, Justin?
Sure, Jacob. Yeah, that's a neat introduction. So, yeah, the Bretton Woods system really is integral to understanding the current global system we have today. So, it's named after a meeting at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. And the meeting actually took place before the end of World War II, actually, interestingly enough. So, so it took place at the Mount Washington Hotel, where delegates from about 44 countries, I believe, all whom were allied with the US, the Allied powers, basically negotiated for a month and established the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Yeah, so John Maynard Keynes of the British Treasury and Harry Dexter White of the US Treasury Department basically drew up this framework for a new fully integrated economic system, a system that was ratified at the meeting at Bretton Woods. So basically, yeah, the central tenet is that the system is comprised of generally fixed exchange rates between international currencies, all anchored by the dollar's convertibility into gold at a fixed price. So, yeah, that's the sort of summary of the Bretton Woods.
So was this agreement really done in the beginning because of the Allied efforts to defeat Nazi Germany?
Yeah, I mean, I think to best sort of approach that question, I think we're going to have to go back in history and look at some of the events in the early 20th century or the first half of the 20th century that shaped the global economic landscape for some greater context and clarity. So, so I mean, the Bretton Woods system was born from an era of enormous tragedy, human suffering, one being the Great Depression and the other two being the two world wars. Yeah. So, I mean, at the close of World War II, many people felt that the world needed a fundamentally new economic system. It's that simple. One that would help avoid the circumstances that led to the hyperinflation in Germany that brought about the collapse of the Weimar Republic, that led to the election of the Nazi Party and would eventually usher in the Second World War, the World War II era. But I mean, memories of the Great Depression and the human suffering that caused were long lasting as well. And so, yeah, basically, I think it was felt that the Bretton Woods Agreement would provide a secure platform for peace, for global peace brought about by mutually beneficial trade that would increase economic prosperity and thus reducing tensions between nations the world over. And yeah, I think that was how the Bretton Woods system sort of came to be. Really, I mean, the world economy was badly damaged after the two world wars and the Great Depression, with countries putting up barriers, restricting imports to protect local manufacturers. This led to like currency wars. National currencies were devalued and weakened. This inflamed international tensions, and yeah, so that's kind of the background to how Bretton Woods came to be, really.
Right. And so it's almost like this is the first time you really get to see the economists and sort of the capitalist theorists talking about how trade is an integral part of maintaining peace between countries, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Bretton Woods system is the first of its kind. It was the first example of an international, fully integrated monetary order that was intended to govern monetary relations and global trade across the world, between independent nations. So that's that's very true. Yeah.
It's kind of like you could almost point to this as the exact moment that you sort of have this vision of, what we know now as globalism, right? This concept of a really big network of trade that binds us all together and keeping the marketplace as safe and secure as possible to maintain that peace and that allegiance between countries.
Right. Well, that's exactly it. That's just it. I mean, understanding the Bretton Woods system is essential because it's here that the framework for the wider globally integrated system that we have today basically began, and it established the US's global hegemony as a dominant geopolitical force, primarily because it was the dominant economic player. I mean, at the end of World War II, it's no exaggeration to say that the United States was easily the country that was in the best shape economically, industrially. So it had 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. It was easily going to be the biggest lender among all the allied nations before the dollar was ratified as a reserve currency, and what have you not. So yeah, that's just it. And even with the fall of Bretton Woods, which we will cover later, is equally significant and reinforced America's position as the global hegemony, the dominant economic player. But I mean, yeah, establishing international peace on the back of mutually beneficial trade was indeed the catalyst for Bretton Woods.
So one of the interesting names I heard you mention earlier was John Maynard Keynes. Was he sort of the British architect of the plan? What was his role in all of this?
Yeah, okay. I mean, that's interesting. I mean, that's a good question. And from there, if you'll allow me, I'll go into a few of the specifics of the Bretton Woods Agreement afterwards. But yeah, so basically the Bretton Woods system was drawn up and developed by John Maynard Keynes from the UK. He was from the Treasury Department, and Harry Dexter White, who was part of the US Treasury Department. I don't think he was the head of the department, but they drew up the framework for Bretton Woods for a fully integrated global system of economic trade and what have you not. It's actually quite interesting because the dollar initially, when the system was set up, I think it's important to know that Keynes proposed something called an ICU bank, which I think it was short for International Clearing Union. The bank would print its own currency called the Bancor, which was which could be redeemed for national currencies at a fixed rate. But Harry Dexter White challenged this. The US representative, the senior US Treasury Department official who was representing America, rejected this outright. He said the dollar should be used as the reserve currency that binded the system together, with optional convertibility into gold if that's what the member states wanted. I mean, again, I just said it, but the US was the most healthy country economically after the close of World War II. It had 2/3 of the world's gold supply, and it was clear to everyone that the US had the capacity to be the largest creditor among all the allied nations as well. I mean, White agreed very favorable conditions for the US with the terms and conditions of the Bretton Woods Agreement, and Keynes didn't oppose it as such. He thought it was a win for the UK as well. And all the other signatory countries looked to the Bretton Woods Accords as a means of securing their prosperity in their post-World War II redevelopment and rebuilding their countries and what have you not. So I hope that covers your...
Right. So were some of the other countries signing on to this? Would you say that some of them kind of signed it under duress? It was really, this is the way the deal's going to be?
Yeah, I mean, most of the allied countries are there. I mean, China, the Soviet Union, obviously Western Europe was there. I mean, the beginnings of the Marshall Plan were being drawn up by Truman and the Harry S. Truman administration. The IMF was integral to that. So I don't know if it was under duress. I mean, what option did the other countries have? I'm not sure if they had a great deal, to be honest. I mean, the human toll, the suffering that World War II led to, was, unprecedented. So, I mean, the Soviet Union did put up some resistance to it, which we could which we'll get into later, I suppose. I mean, I think some were. I think a lot more opposition would come in the coming decades, to be honest, as the economic climate kind of shifted and changed, if you will. But
all right. So World War II comes to an end, and the role of the Bretton Woods Agreement, it has a lot to do with the Marshall Plan and the foundation of the IMF. And would you talk about that a little bit for us?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so that's great. So let's go into the system itself, shall we? I mean, before Bretton Woods, gold was the chosen unit for settling balance of payments between countries and trade deficits and so on and so forth. But after Bretton Woods, gold was replaced by dollars as a means of settling existing balance of payments deficits, and the US held onto the gold in its central banks, and that could be redeemed for dollars if the sovereign nations decided they wanted to do that. So, I mean, I think there's three basic objectives to the Bretton Woods system. I mean, establishing the dollar as the world's reserve currency under a generally fixed exchange rate system anchored by the dollar's convertibility into gold at a fixed price, as we said a couple of times. That was the first one. Number two would be the advent of the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, whose purpose was to promote stability of exchange rates and financial flows and help basically correct any balance of payment deficits, what have you not. And the last I would say, is to rebuild the international trading system into a fully integrated global economy that would boost GDP and prosperity alongside it, avoiding hyperinflation and deflation as such. And beyond these objectives, the Bretton Woods system established the earliest incarnations of the World Bank. That was then referred to as the IBRD, the International Bank for Redevelopment, Reconstruction and Development, and the World Trade Organization, which was referred to as GATT, the General Association on Tariffs and Trade. So those are maybe some of the finer points of the system. The International Monetary Fund is the central one, I think. So, the International Monetary Fund works with member states that are facing economic hardship, helps them restructure their debts and liabilities. It was intended to maintain the foreign exchange market, the market rates, the system that was pegged to gold, so adjusting foreign currencies in a fair way so that member states wouldn't have an advantage over other competing nations and what have you not. So it helped the member states who had trouble paying back money it borrowed and restructure those debts and liabilities alongside favourable lines. Basically, it's raison d'etre states that, if the currency became too weak relative to the dollar, it would buy up its currency in foreign exchange markets, lowering supply, raising the price as such. If it became too strong, if it was too high, the bank would just print more of that unit's currency, release it onto the global money markets, increasing supply, lowering its price as a result. So, the IMF is obviously still operational today.
With what really amounts to a tremendous amount of power, it seems. But I think, we can cover that more down the line.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
One of the interesting observations that I had, which I don't know how true it is, but at some point, would it be fair to say that the IMF and that the Bretton Woods Agreement begins to really work against the Soviet Union and almost function as sort of an offset to their power?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I would agree with that. The Soviet Union are interesting because they were invited and they attended the Bretton Woods meeting, but they walked out and they didn't sign it. They said that the Bretton Woods Accords were basically an extension of Wall Street and they didn't want anything to do with it. So, that's obviously significant on a number of levels. Certainly, I'm sure your listeners are familiar with the Cold War and what that entailed. But basically, because the IMF and the World Bank were to work alongside a lot of the nations that were badly damaged in World War II through the Marshall Plan, which was a part of the wider Truman Doctrine aimed at containing the spread of communism. Left-wing ideologies, communism was rampant even at the end of World War II, even at the close of World War II. You have the Iron Curtain in Europe, which separated the line of demarcation between the Soviet Union's sphere of influence and the United States' sphere of influence. So, just going back, going by Soviet borders, obviously Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, all the way round in the crescent off at Albania with the former Yugoslavia in the centre. And that was all within the the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. So, the US was to aid redevelopment of Europe through the IMF, through the World Bank, and sort of protecting its interests there. And so, yeah, I mean, it's kind of it's part of that. Yeah, it's all part of the Bretton Woods needs to be understood within the Cold War era, to get a better understanding of both the Accords, the Bretton Woods Accords, and the Cold War, and the Soviet Union and the United States ongoing sort of struggles. So, yeah, right. It definitely functions in that sense as well. I mean, the Soviets had their own plans for growing soft power through economic means as well, of course. I mean, and don't forget they have a huge communist bloc on its border as well in China, which kind of sort of functions as an extension of the communist sphere of influence, if you like. So yeah, that's all significant as well. That's all very significant too, definitely.
Excellent. So basically, the Bretton Woods Agreement is doing a really good job as far as rebuilding Europe. And, we could perhaps even say it has a role in a lot of the politics that you're guessing in Latin American countries and even in Asia. And generally, the job's going along pretty smoothly, but eventually we're going to hit a road bump, right? Is there anything you'd like to discuss before we get to the road bump?
No, I think we've sort of covered everything. I might just summarize and say, so the Bretton Woods Agreement was a first attempt at a fully integrated global trading apparatus, a global integrated economy, if you like, establishing the dollar as the world's reserve currency, which is still in play today, and is it can't be underestimated in terms of the role it plays in the 20th and 21st centuries. We'll get on to more establishing the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organizations, at least the earliest incarnations as well. I would say, in summary, the Bretton Woods Accords basically said to national governments, look, you're responsible for maintaining full employment. The IMF was responsible for maintaining the fixed exchange rates, managing any anomalies in trade and deficits between countries. The GATT, the General Association for Tariffs and Trade, was entrusted with promoting world trade. And the IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which would eventually become the World Bank, was the lending arm of the Bretton Woods institutions, and that's how they went on, really. Yeah, so that's how things went on. But yeah, the bump in the road. There's always a bump.
That's right. And that is what actually leads to giving us a whole new super important word. But before we get to that word that is often never fully understood, I think we have to talk about the crisis in gold that really started all of this. So eventually we run into a big bump in the road in the form of the price of gold.
Yeah, that's right. So this will eventually lead to basically the fall of Bretton Woods and what's called the 1971 Nixon shock. But basically during the Vietnam War, the broader international community, if you like, realized that the US was printing more dollars to fund the war than it had in gold. And a lot of countries wanted to return their dollar reserves in exchange for their gold back, to be honest. So this caused a rapid decline in the value of the dollar, would have produced a run on the dollar, would have led to near total, complete collapse. So yeah, that's definitely the next installment. So the end of Bretton Woods. So where to pick up on? So after World War II, set against a backdrop of the Marshall Plan, the Bretton Woods system was in full flow. There were growing economies across the world, especially in Europe and Japan, and everything was working well. Demand for American goods remained high. I think especially farming equipment, anything related to steel, and consistently, world trade by pure volume was just getting higher and increasing at a consistent level. But by the 1960s, things took a turn for the worse. The US was facing increasingly precarious economic circumstances. They had a growing negative balance of payments, that is, money coming into the country and leaving the country, rising public debt incurred by expenditures related to the Vietnam War, and monetary inflation by the Federal Reserve, basically all caused the dollar to become overvalued on the international markets. So, and by, I think, about 1966, it became apparent to everyone that the US didn't have enough gold to secure the mass surplus of dollars that had been accumulated in non-US central banks. Overseas, US central banks had about $14 billion, roughly, and the US held about $13.2 billion in gold reserves. But that doesn't sound like a very big imbalance there. But what you have to understand is that most of what America held in gold was to cover domestic holdings, really, not foreign holdings or foreign liabilities, what have you not. And the problem is that with the Bretton Woods Agreement, the Bretton Woods Accords, the US dollars flooded international markets. The US had to allow the dollar to accumulate outside of US territory and basically beyond its control. And this vast accumulation of dollars just couldn't be redeemed in gold, as the world supply of gold could not keep up with the way the dollar was being traded and circulated. So it could no longer function as a metallic base for the dollar anymore. The Fed increased the money supply by about 10% in 1971, and by that time, a lot of European countries were simply unwilling to revalue their currency. France and Switzerland started redeeming their dollars for gold, and this was increasing America's inflationary problems. I think in the case of France, Charles de Gaulle actually went above and beyond his Treasury Department, said, no, we're going to be swapping our dollars for gold back. We want our gold back. West Germany suddenly left the Bretton Woods Agreement. They formally left it. They were unwilling to revalue the Deutschmark against the dollar in a move that would actually strengthen their economy as well. And things were getting really serious. So in an effort to protect the US against what they called foreign price gougers, Congress basically recommended devaluing the dollar, and basically pressure on the US to leave Bretton Woods began to intensify quite a lot. So and then came what's known as the Nixon shock, or the 1971 Nixon shock, which is basically, before I go into it, it's basically a series of sweeping economic reforms implemented by, of course, President Richard Nixon in August 1971, the most significant of which saw him cancel the convertibility of the dollar to gold, thus removing the dollar off the gold standard and disabandoning the gold peg altogether. Under the Bretton Woods Agreement, the dollar was backed by gold, of course. That's the central tenet of the agreement that kept it together. But the Nixon shock effectively resigned the dollar to becoming a floating fiat currency. A floating currency is one whose value appreciates and depreciates according to the market. A fiat currency is a currency that's backed by nothing other than itself, and that's exactly what happened. Yeah.
And that's very interesting for all of this to be happening pretty much in the middle of the Vietnam War.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. The Nixon administration, they had challenges, from across the spectrum, domestically, internationally, monetarily. Unemployment was about 6% and inflation was about 5.8%, but both were rising. The US's situation was serious. It was deteriorating, and immediate action needed to be taken. So Nixon called a meeting at Camp David, a secret meeting as to what the US should do in order to reduce inflation, reduce employment, stabilize the dollar, and ultimately strengthen the US economy and improve its prospects. So under the advice of Secretary Connolly, Nixon decided that the Bretton Woods system would be abandoned and the gold peg removed. And with that, as I said earlier, the dollar became a floating fiat currency. And to many people, Nixon committed probably what's been called, the greatest act of theft in modern history, really. Yeah. So, but he had no choice because, he really had no choice, because if he failed to prevent another run on the dollar with European countries exchanging their dollars for gold, it would have meant economic catastrophe for the US. He would have almost certainly been insolvent. So he almost had no choice. And I think he interrupted Sunday afternoon television. I always forget the name of that show that was airing, to address the entire American nation that, the US had left the gold standard. And that was critical. Yeah. So what that meant was that the dollar could no longer be exchanged for gold or other assets, and that foreign governments could literally not get their dollars back. And the central tenet of Bretton Woods was removed. And Nixon, by confiscating the gold, he basically said, look, we're not paying our debts and you're going to have to deal with it. And that's it. You can actually find the recording on YouTube. It's quite telling, actually. Yeah, it's very interesting, between Secretary Connolly and President Nixon.
So for all of us who don't really fully understand the ramifications, it's basically a situation where France, Britain, all of these other countries, they fully believe that all of the reserves they had would be redeemable. So effectively, they believe that their national reserves and dependable hard currency is sitting in Fort Knox. But
yeah, absolutely.
At the end of the day, it's not.
Well, no. At the close of World War II, a lot of your listeners may even know this, but a lot of Europe's elite, it's rich and powerful, it's industrial leaders, took their wealth, took their gold and deposited it in the US because they knew it'd be safe there. They swapped their local currencies for gold and other assets, other precious metals, and sent them to the US. That's how the US have accumulated such a huge amount of gold at the close of World War II. But it's exactly as you describe it. It was an act of theft, but I suppose by that time, the US had just amassed so much power that it would have, nobody was going to stand up to them, and that was a situation, I suppose. But Nixon literally saying, we're not paying our debts. And the interview, the broadcasting should be as famous as, Kennedy's assassination, George W. Bush's "Read My Lips," Bill Clinton's "I did not have" with that woman, but it's kind of not. It's kind of. I mean, a lot of people. A lot of people know the moment. I mean, certainly. I mean, I don't know. I'm not American. I'm British. But I mean, I'm sure even a lot of your parents, your viewers' parents, may even remember the broadcasts. So yeah, that was it. There were a few other. I mean, it won't take me long. A few other policies that were enacted at the same time. I mean, wages and prices were frozen in order to combat inflation. A 10% tax was levied on imports in order to protect domestic industry, but that didn't last. That was removed in December of the same year as well. But it was the first time the US had enacted wage and price control since World War II, I believe. So it was supposed to be temporary, but it didn't. And I think in 1976, the US government officially changed the actual statutory definition of the dollar and removed any reference to gold from its statutes and what have you not. So that's it, because government spending was no longer constrained by gold. It was allowed to float according to the markets. And then what we now know as debt financing and deficit spending, especially the latter, deficit spending, pretty much took off from there. So that's when governments spend in spite of the fact that it has a deficit of money it's taking in from money it's spending. So it's significant in so many ways. I mean, you could write books on this, but yeah.
Right. So we're now at a point between 1971 and going forward to the latter half of the 70s. The US dollar is really functioning as very much just a free-floating currency, as I understand it. And it was still the reserve currency for the world, based off of almost this sort of unilateral declaration that kind of happens from the Nixon shock. But I think at this point, they're going to have to tie this to something, right? And this is kind of where the move towards the very famous word, the petrodollar, comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's safe to say, the first half of the 70s was a difficult time in America. I think retrospectively, Nixon actually did very well, but it was a precarious time. The petrodollar is a name given for the oil for dollars bilateral relationship the United States has with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but more broadly the OPEC community, the oil producing countries, particularly in the Gulf states in the Arab world. It's a euphemistic name. It's not an actual dollar like, Disney dollars or something. So that's right. So this is sort of the next stage in the development of, this wider neoliberal global integrated economy we have. So, I mean, it's hard to know where to start. I mean, there's Bretton Woods, there's a Nixon shock. I think we can go into the 1973 oil embargo. Now, this is something that your parents will definitely remember. Mine do as well, and they're not sort of politically minded in a way. But basically, between 71 and 73, the purchasing power of the dollar dropped significantly. At the close of the Bretton Woods, before Nixon removed the peg, I think 1 ounce of gold was worth about $135 in 1973, 2 years after the shock. But another crisis was on the horizon in the wake of something called the Yom Kippur War, which was a war between Israel and several of the...
That's okay. So the Yom Kippur War basically is when several Arab countries all joined together to invade Israel. Is that right?
Sorry about that. Yeah, that's right. So a coalition of Arab countries sort of once again combined to sort of attack Israel, and it after it became apparent that US and various other Western countries were sort of aiding and abetting Israel one way or another, OPEC reduced output of oil by about 25% over several months, and the price of oil went from $3 a barrel to almost $12 globally, and that culminated in the oil embargo of 1973, and it was an oil crisis that set about numerous sort of effects. And it was more precarious times for the dollar in the midst of an oil crisis, a rising deficit, a weakening dollar. The US actually proposed military intervention in Saudi Arabia to secure the oil fields and their long-term interests, as they saw the Saudis as disrupting the global economy, jeopardizing international peace. And of course, the Cold War is raging on in the background. So that's where the petrodollar sort of comes into play, if you like. So in 1973, Nixon again and Henry Kissinger basically asked King Faisal of Saudi Arabia to only accept US dollars as payment for oil. In return, the US would provide military support for the Saudi oil fields and generally to the House of Saud, basically effectively guaranteeing their rule over the kingdom. They also agreed to take measures to stabilize the dollar and sell weapons, many of which were amassed during the Vietnam War and weren't used to the Saudis, as well as various sort of infrastructure contracts, various kind of contracting negotiations with US companies as well. And that's how the petrodollar sort of came in. So basically, effectively, the dollar was moved off the gold peg in 71, and by 73 it was moved on to oil. But by 1975, basically every OPEC member, Kuwait, Iraq, so on and so forth, agreed to sell their oil in US dollars only. And this was hugely significant for a number of reasons. The terms of the arrangement also stated, and this is highly significant, that Saudi Arabia pledged to recycle excess dollars from oil exports by buying up US securities and treasury bonds, and by contracting US firms for capital infrastructure projects as well across the kingdom. And basically reinvesting those dollars from oil sales into US money markets, particularly Wall Street. Actually, this is also a feature of the Marshall Plan as well. A lot of European countries recycled surplus dollars back into the US money markets. And, that's how we've got this huge, financial services, financial industries economy, really. But that's probably a discussion for another day. But the petrodollar was, a hugely significant number of levels. The balance of power was restored in America's favor. And, it basically means that, so this is kind of, it gets a little bit nuanced, Jacob. So I'll say this kind of slowly, but basically the US receives a nominal sum of Federal Reserve paper of US dollars on every oil purchase it makes, thus basically creating a revenue stream that runs parallel to its oil purchases, if you see what I mean. So it's
So it's through the oil that we purchase, and even maybe the oil that other people purchase, that we also begin getting forms of reinvestment, because the Saudis know that part of this deal is that part of the profits are immediately going to be reinvested into the financial market of the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it. So, yeah, it's every oil purchase increases the demand for US dollars. So it really is a very sort of beneficial sort of system. I can go into this in more sort of depth if you like.
I
So
think we'll definitely need to do that a little bit down the line. I'm really impressed with the way time has flied as it is already being, you know, uh, over 45 minutes into the episode.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. It's been good. We've covered a lot of ground. Yeah, I mean, there's probably a bit more to do on the petrodollar, but I'm glad we've kind of got the overview and your listeners can sort of piece together um, how the post-World War II global economy sort of took shape with
Sure.
America in the center. Mm.
Sure. So before I get into just some questions to help wrap it up, would you like to add anything more on the petrodollar just to bring us to a proper stopping point before we start another episode and maybe
Mm.
do a little bit more with the petrodollar at that point?
Yeah, I mean, it's significant on a number of levels. I mean, for a start, is the fact that the US creates this parallel revenue stream with oil purchases. So when it purchases oil from the OPEC nations, those nations take a certain nominal sum of that and reinvest that either back into the US money markets or by contracting US firms. It's very clever. But the other thing is, because OPEC members will only sell their oil for dollars, that forces every oil important nation to maintain a sustainable supply of Federal Reserve paper. You need dollars to purchase oil. That means before you buy oil, you need to purchase dollars first to fund any oil transactions. You need oil for energy. You need oil to build industries. You need oil to build entire economies and prosperity with that. So you can't do any of that without accruing dollars, so to speak. So countries had to trade with the US on favorable terms as such and needed to keep ample foreign currency reserves in dollars. So basically dollars went out and everything the US wanted, everything the US needed came flooding in as a result. So, and then the third thing I would say is that, all countries that sell oil must do so in dollars. So if the dollar loses value, so does their oil and their oil markets, and any industry that's tied to oil or oil revenues will be negatively affected in the process. So yeah, those are probably the three things that I would sort of round up on the
So,
petrodollar. But we can get into those at a later date in more
sure.
depth, or as you like, if you want to do now. It's up to you. Yeah.
Sure. So touching on that last point, it's really kind of interesting because historically, before Bretton Woods, before we get to the petrodollar and all that, it would be kind of a rare occasion, I imagine, for a nation to literally have other countries so invested in their currency that, at the end of the day, Saudi Arabia is deeply invested in the worth of the US dollar, and they will go to the mat, so to speak, to defend the US dollar if push comes to shove. It's almost like
Yeah.
because of the petrodollar, you've really established a default team of nations who will, live and die by this because they're fully invested in it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just Saudi Arabia. I mean, you could say the whole economy is invested in the dollar. I mean, the dollar is a reserve currency for goods, services, assets, commodities, investments, the global money markets, all these, hedge funds and, credit default swaps, all of this stock buybacks, all this stuff. I mean, it's all denominated in dollar debts. Yeah, I mean, the global financial system is based on this. Yeah, it's very true. I mean, I think many people at the time coined the phrase absorbitant privilege that the US has. I mean, even some American commentators said, look, at the end of the day, it's not really fair because European countries, Japan, have to stump up $100 of physical goods, assets or services to get $100 bill. America can just print it for, several cents or fraction of a cent at, one of its central banks or something. So, it really is, sort of one of a kind, and system, and everything being priced in dollars makes the US makes the dollar the most dominant currency in the world, and it makes America the most dominant country in the world as well. I mean, in economic terms, as it's the most traded currency, and the most in-demand currency, there's always downward pressure on the dollar. So that allows the US to print more units of currency, knowing that the fact that it's the default currency in the world, the most traded, the most in demand, there will always be leveraging against inflation and deflation, if you like, against a hyperinflation or hyperdeflation process. So it also means that the US can issue dollar-denominated debts at very low rates of interest because it's it's the most liquid, reliable, and convenient currency in the world. Say, for example, Brazil with the real, or India with the rupee. Countries are much less likely to invest in those securities because their currencies aren't as liquid, aren't as fluid as a dollar, right? But what they can do is that they can buy up dollars, exchange those for dollars, and issue their debt in US dollars, and then they'll get buyers. So the international market. So again, you could easily spend an hour sort of going through all the advantages that this system gives America, and there are numerous certain privileges that are afforded to America, both at home and abroad. I mean, they're allowed to spend big at home and overseas, expanding their sphere of influence, their geopolitical goals ahead of their competitors. Obviously, the Soviet Union during the Cold War thing. I mean, we literally have an asymmetrical financial system where other countries support America's borrowing and spending habits, and that's no understatement. Sorry, yeah.
That's a really beautiful way to say it, an asymmetrical financial system, because that's what it really is.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe one final question here. It's not that exciting, but so could you say it's kind of the case that when people invest in the United States, there's a certain security because they know that, perhaps this isn't exactly the perfect investment. Maybe the business or the real estate, etc., won't perform that well, but it's still completely different than when you invest in a country like Thailand or Indonesia, or even a more stable economy like Korea, because you're not just worrying about the investment itself when you do that, but is it also the case that you're also worried about the currency of the country you've invested in? Whereas, go on.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose so. I mean, one thing that about actually harping back all the way to the beginning of the conversation about Bretton Woods, only the US was given authority to print US dollars, and also nobody could supervise the inner workings of the Fed actually either. So, I mean, most debts that nations hold are denominated in US dollars. Foreign currency reserves that central banks hold are again denominated in US dollars, and countries need ample reserves of Federal Reserve paper in the event of an economic downturn, e.g., for example, the 2008 global economic crash, where at one point it looked like there wasn't enough dollars to go round and such. So to cover their liabilities and such, they need US dollars. It's the most fluid, the most liquid currency on the market. There will always be buyers because because it's a self-perpetuating cycle. Currencies constantly need an inflow of Federal Reserve paper, so there will always be buyers, and that means that the interest rate will be low because demand is high, and that makes the US dollar much more favorable compared to, I don't know, the euro and so on and so forth, and other competing currencies too. So yeah, it's like I say, it's a reinforcing cycle in terms of the global economy, American hegemony, and so on and so forth. So
it's almost kind of like the global economy at this point. The dollar is it's so basic to everything that's happening that even when you see it fluctuate a little bit and you say, oh, looks like the euro is strong against the dollar today, this is really kind of a it's a short-term observation, because ultimately, because of the way that the economy is structured, the dollar is basically always king, is what it sounds like.
Well, yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I suppose it's the way that the global economy is kind of structured as such. Yeah, I mean, it's it just allows America so many privileges in terms of debt financing, America issuing its debt on the global markets and so on and so forth, deficit spending, allowing them to run up huge deficits. Its debt is huge, obviously, and so on and so forth. I mean, spending abroad and at home, the mass deindustrialization of parts of America, restructuring of capitalism is all done under this finance-based economy where the dollar is central. And but yeah, I mean, it's a funny one because at the same time, you could also say it's almost like a dam in a way. Yeah, you can have a huge, really powerful dam, but if there's a crack there, if it cracks, the whole thing capitulates. And any attack on the dollar is seen as an act of war by the US. The US will use no end of military force in order to destroy, eviscerate anything that poses a real threat to the dollar's supremacy. I mean, we saw that in Iraq, we saw that in Libya. They demonstrate this perfectly. They won't accept anything attacking the dollar. Simply put, I mean, So I mean, yeah, it's huge. Yeah, it's you can't underestimate its significance and. On the global stage, so to speak. So I don't know if another currency would really threaten the dollar. I mean, most countries have an excess supply of dollars. Ireland, Luxembourg, small countries have. I mean, China and Japan could probably provide dollar liquidity in the event of a financial downturn without the US, without the Federal Reserve printing press. Do you know what I mean?
Which is remarkable.
Well, yeah, because they've amassed such a surplus of US dollars that, I mean, you can see the language is being repeated. You remember I said at the end of Bretton Woods, the European countries said because the dollar had been allowed to accumulate outside of US territory, the European countries found themselves with a surplus of US dollars. And it's a similar thing. Russia as well. I mean, Vladimir Putin has been onto this system since I was in middle school, and unfortunately, that was a long time ago, before the millennia. I mean, it really, yeah, it is. Again, absorbed some privilege and everything. But the problem is, the world is so dependent on the dollar that if the dollar fell, so much of the global economic infrastructure would collapse as well. I mean, China, you may have heard of Chimerica, perhaps your listeners have. the Chinese-American relationship. I mean, they depend on the US purchasing its stuff. That's why China is one of the biggest buyers of US consumer debt, of US sovereign debt. So that America can carry on making purchases from China. It's this weird relationship where China buys the debt and loans dollars to America for them to buy all the cheap crap from Walmart that it needs. It just this cycle that you look at it and you're like, how does this stuff just not fall in on itself? How does this work? It's
Wow.
it's kind of bizarre. It's your head, you just can't get around it. But
that's really going to be a lot of material for us to be looking into in future episodes.
Yeah, I mean, is there anything else you want to clear up, or anything else you want to go very quickly, perhaps?
Already, as it stands, I feel like my head is swimming with all of that information at the end. And, well, I just have to say, I really look forward to the next show that we will be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's been really enjoyable. I mean, I've had a lot of fun going over this stuff. Is always it's always helpful. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll be closing with that. Everybody have a very excellent week.
Take care, guys. Thank you. Bye.
Mm-hmm.